To understand the present, you must know the recent past. For much of the 20th century, Nepal was a monarch. Kings ruled and political power was concentrated in the hands of the elites. That began to change as democratic pressure rose, but the real rupture came in the 1990s and 2000s. A Maoist insurgency, a decade-long conflict, tore the country apart, with thousands killed, villages attacked, and communities traumatized. That war ended with a settlement. The monarchy's power was removed, and in 2008, Nepal was declared a federal democratic republic. A republic, however, did not equal stability. Since 2008, Nepal has seen frequent government collapses, brutal collisions, and a politics of personalities more than institutions. Parties split and reformed, corruption scandals repeatedly damaged trust. The constitution adopted in 2015 tried to create federal structures and protect minority rights, but it also created new disputes over boundaries, representation, and resources. Put it simply, Nepal shifted from a centralized monarch to a weak, fragmented democracy that has not delivered consistent jobs, services, or even opportunities. That political fragility and persistent sense that the elites benefit while most people struggle created fertile ground for mass discontent. When the ban was proposed, activists used the platforms to expose something else, a parade of elites' privileges. Screenshots and short videos showed children of top officials living abroad, private schools, luxury cars, and lifestyles far removed from the reality of most Nepalis. Those images spread quickly. Anger mounted. Protests began in the cities, especially Kathmandu. At first, they were very peaceful: students, recent graduates, and young workers chanting for accountability and jobs. Police tried to control the crowds with tear gas. In several clashes, live rounds were used. The confrontations escalated. Crowds pushed into government compounds. Some buildings, including parts of Singadaba complex, were set on fire. The violence shocked the nation. Under enormous pressure, the Prime Minister resigned. Curfews followed. Airports were disrupted. The army loomed at the edge of politics. What began as a pushback against online restrictions had morphed into a full-blown challenge to a political order. The core of these protests are young people, Gen Z and young millennials. They are students, informal workers, small business operators, and young professionals who feel the system has no space for them. Many have degrees but no jobs. Many see families with land or connections getting richer while their futures stagnate. Tactically, these protests are decentralized. There is no single leader issuing commands. Organizing happens through chats, hashtags, and viral videos. The digital-first coordination made them agile and hard to negotiate with the traditional backroom politics. Symbols matter. The social media ban became a shorthand for all the ways power is controlled and voices shut down. The protest also fused urban street demonstrations with online campaigns, a double pressure on those in power. The state response mixed repression and concession. Security forces used force, curfews and restrictions tightened. At the same time, the political center fractured. Parties argued about how to respond, and the Prime Minister resigned under pressure. That resignation did not magically solve structural problems. Poverty, unemployment, and fragile institutions remain. There is also an international dimension. Nepal sits between India and China, and both are watching keenly. Neither wants instability on its borders, and both can influence Nepali politics through investment, aid, and political ties. For many ordinary Nepalis, international politics are a background to worry. The immediate concern is whether this protest moment will bring real accountability or just another cycle of empty promises. Now, let's move to Kenya and the summer of June 2024, a clear example of youth-led disruption reshaping national politics. The immediate trigger was the finance bill, which proposed new taxes on essential and digital services. For a population already struggling with rising cost of living and high youth unemployment, the bill felt like a final insult. Young Kenyans mobilized, hashtags spread, small online groups flipped into large street marches. In cities across the country, Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa, Kakamega, and beyond, thousands converged on public squares and outside parliament. The protests were leaderless and decentralized, driven by young organizers and independents tired of waiting for institutional fixes. protests, they demanded the government to withdraw the bill, to stop punitive taxes on basic goods, and take seriously youth unemployment and corruption concerns. The speed and scale of the protests surprised the administration. What followed was a tense face-off between energetic street mobilization and state security forces determined to restore order. Kenya's state response was forceful tear gas, water cannons, and in some tragic cases, live fire. Demonstrators who attempted to storm parliament were met with severe repression. By the end of the main wave, dozens of young people had lost their lives, and many more were injured. The violence was raw, painful for families and communities across the country. Politically, however, the protests achieved immediate results. The finance bill was effectively shelved, and the government moved to address some of the grievances publicly. Ministers were reshuffled, and debates about accountability and public spending accelerated. Yet the human cost, dead, injured, traumatized families, left a scar. And for many young Kenyans, the short-term policy wins seemed less important than deeper structural problems that remained unsolved. Lack of jobs, sense of exclusion, and distrust of institutions. And now let's do a direct comparison between the demonstrations that happened in Kenya in June 2024 and these that are happening in Nepal. First, both movements are driven by a generation that grew up online and uses digital tools to organize. Both were triggered by specific policies or acts that symbolized deeper injustice, as social media clamped down in Nepal and economic austerity measures in Kenya. Both protests exposed elite privilege and anger at exclusion. They were also decentralized and leaderless, making negotiation harder for a traditional political machinery. Both produced immediate political consequences, resignations, and political reversals, and both revealed the cruelty of heavy-handed state responses that cost lives and trust. Finally, both show that the digital era, public outrage can coalesce and explode faster than institutions can adapt. But also there are differences between these two political revolutions. In Nepal's protests that erupted in the context of deep institutional fragility after decades of political transition, that is a monarch to a republic, and the history of insurgents and fragmentation, in Kenya, there are differences that can be drawn from these two protests. Nepal's protests erupted in the context of deep institutional fragility after decades of political transition, monarchy to a republic, and a history of insurgency and fragmentation. In Kenya, the protests came from frustration with economic policy and the cost of living with a long-established multi-party state. Nepal's strategic location between India and China adds geopolitical risk that Kenya does not share the same degree. Tactics and targets also differed. Nepal's protests aimed directly at the state symbols and institutions in the capital. Kenya's protests were more focused on economic policy and national accountability. What both stories teach us is very, very urgent. Young people who are connected, organized, and excluded will act. Governments that ignore economic pain, corruption, and need for meaningful representation risk facing not only protests but deep erosion of legitimacy. Whether in Kathmandu or Nairobi, there is a difficult, narrow chance for institutional reform if leaders listen and act. If they don't, cycles of protest and repression will continue. As the protests escalated in Nepal, anger moved beyond chants and marches. In some dramatic moments, several political leaders were caught by protesters, beaten and even stripped of their clothes before being paraded through the streets. This was shocking, a raw display of rage at leaders seen as corrupt and out of touch. It showed not only rejection of the authority, but also a symbolic act, stripping away the power and privilege that the people felt had been stolen from them. This intensity marked a difference from what we saw in Nairobi in June 2024. In Kenya, protesters stormed parliament, faced police bullets, and forced the withdrawal of the finance bill, but they did not publicly humiliate the leaders in the same way. The protests in Nairobi were fierce, but their symbolism stayed focused on political institutions. The The protest in Nairobi was fierce, but their symbolism stayed focused on policy and institutions, not physically targeting individuals.